Imagine, for a moment, that you are living in a small, peaceful town, just going about your daily routine, when suddenly, you hear about a crime that shakes the community to its core. It is a crime that seems so unfathomable, so terrifying, that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety and security. This is the world we find ourselves in when we talk about the disturbing cases we are about to delve into. These are stories where answers were hard to come by, where the victims' families spent years, even decades, searching for justice. And, in some of these cases, justice was finally achieved, but not without a cost. What happens when years pass, when investigations stall, and when the people responsible for terrible acts of violence remain free? How does technology, persistence, and sheer willpower change everything? This video will take you through 3 deeply unsettling cases. Cases that were finally solved after years of haunting mystery. These cases are about the innocent lives lost, the pain that loved ones endured, and the relentless pursuit of answers. But they are also about something larger, the systems we put in place to seek justice, and how they often fail, sometimes, against all odds, succeed. In the first case, we will explore the murder of a promising young woman named Bonnie Craig. Her case remained unsolved for over a decade, and what followed was a journey that would expose flaws in investigative methods, but also highlight the potential of new forensic technology. In the second case, the brutal murders of Eric and Pam Ellander, a quiet, rural couple in Louisiana, shattered their community, and the investigation into their deaths would reveal dark secrets about the people closest to them. And in the final case, we will uncover the shocking murder of Brooke Baker, a fearless journalism student whose investigation into campus assault put her life at risk in ways no one could have anticipated. Her story, too, remained unsolved until a twist of fate led to a chilling breakthrough. But before we dive into these cases, let us take a moment to reflect on the nature of crime and justice. What happens when the law fails us? When it seems like the bad guys are getting away? What do we do as a society to ensure that justice is not just an idea, but a reality? In our modern world, it is easy to take the idea of justice for granted. We see it in TV shows, in movies, and on social media. Solving crimes seems quick and efficient. But the truth is, real-life investigations are often much messier, much more complicated, and far more time-consuming. Sometimes, the cases that seem the most clear-cut can take years to solve. In the cases we are about to look at, justice was not instantaneous. It came after long waits, false leads, and painful moments of doubt. For Bonnie Craig's family, it took 12 years for the truth to come to light. For Eric and Pam Ellander's family, a confession seemed like the end of the case, only for new evidence to raise more questions. And for Brooke Baker, her parents lived with the fear that her investigation would lead to her death, and the years-long search for her killer was just as frustrating and terrifying as the murder itself. These stories are not just about crime. They are about the systems of power that we trust to protect us, and the ways those systems can fail us. They are about the technological advances that allowed justice to be served when human error or corruption held it back. They are about the victims who are often forgotten, their names fading into the background as time goes on, but their families never forget. Justice is often an uphill battle, and it is important to understand that it does not always look the way we expect. In these cases, technology, tenacity, and a bit of luck made all the difference. But for so many other cases, justice still remains elusive. Now that we have set the stage, let us dive into the first case, the tragic and haunting story of Bonnie Craig. Bonnie Craig was just 18 years old when she vanished on the morning of September 28, 1994. Born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, Bonnie was a bright and ambitious young woman. She had a promising future ahead of her, excelling academically, socially, and even in extracurricular activities. She was active in her community, founding a chapter of Students Against Drunk driving after a close friend was killed in a car accident. She was known for her compassion, her loyalty to her friends, and her desire to make a difference. Her family described her as a young woman who faced the challenges of moving around due to her stepfather's career, but she took it all in stride. By the time she reached high school in Anchorage, Bonnie had become involved in numerous activities. From playing the violin in her school orchestra to coaching youth, swimming, and diving. She was an overachiever, the kind of person who put everything she had into whatever she set her mind to. At the start of her freshman year at the University of Alaska Anchorage, Bonnie seemed to be on the path to greatness. She had a boyfriend stationed at a military base in Texas and maintained a long-distance relationship with him, despite the physical separation. Her future was bright, until one morning, when she simply disappeared. That morning, Bonnie left her home in South Anchorage at around 5:00 a.m. She was heading out to catch a bus to her early English class. With her textbooks and notebook in her backpack, Bonnie seemed like any other student on their way to class. But something went horribly wrong. When she did not arrive at her class, her family became concerned. Bonnie never missed a class, and she was an incredibly responsible student. Her friends and family knew something was terribly wrong. Witnesses later reported seeing a young woman matching Bonnie's description walking along Rabbit Creek Road in the early hours. However, no one saw her board the bus, and there was no sign of her on campus. The investigation into Bonnie's disappearance began, but it was not until much later that the horrific truth was revealed. Her body was discovered later that day by a hiker in McHugh Creek, a rugged and scenic area south of Anchorage. The body was partially submerged, and the scene suggested a brutal attack. Bonnie had suffered blunt force trauma to her head, at least 11 severe lacerations to the back of her skull, along with evidence of sexual assault. Signs of hypothermia and drowning suggested she may have still been alive when her body was dumped into the creek, though she was too injured to survive for long. The discovery of Bonnie Craig's body was a shock, not only to her family, but to the entire community of Anchorage. The peaceful, small-town atmosphere was shattered, and the question on everyone's mind was, who could have done this to such a bright and promising young woman? How could someone take her life so brutally? At first, investigators considered the possibility that Bonnie's death was accidental. They speculated that perhaps she had fallen from the cliff into McHugh Creek, a dangerous and rugged area. But as the medical examiner conducted the autopsy, it became clear that this was no accident. Bonnie's injuries were too severe, too targeted. She had been violently attacked. The autopsy revealed that Bonnie had suffered 11 severe lacerations to the back of her skull, caused by blunt force trauma. This was not an accident. This was murder. There was also evidence of drowning and hypothermia, suggesting that she may have been alive when her body was thrown into the creek. This revelation made it even more harrowing. Bonnie had likely fought for her life, and even in her final moments, she was subjected to unimaginable cruelty. As the investigation continued, the case seemed to hit one dead end after another. Authorities initially focused on possible suspects, but every lead seemed to fizzle out. Early theories about a revenge killing related to Bonnie's mother, Karen Foster, who had worked undercover for the Anchorage Police Department, never panned out. While Karen had posed as a drug buyer to help arrest local dealers, there was no solid evidence linking the murder to a drug lord or a retaliatory motive. The investigation stalled. For years, Bonnie's family, particularly her mother, Karen, pushed for answers, but the case seemed to slip further into the background. In the face of this, Karen became an outspoken critic of the investigation, convinced that detectives had dismissed key pieces of evidence. Bonnie's case was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about confronting the shortcomings of the justice system, the very system that was supposed to protect her daughter. The more I look into cases like Bonnie's, the more I realize how often we take law enforcement's initial assumptions at face value. In this case, the idea that it could have been an accident was an easy conclusion, especially in a remote, rugged area like McHugh Creek. But sometimes, the most obvious answers are the wrong ones. It took a relentless push from Bonnie's family to challenge the assumptions and to keep the case from being forgotten. This highlights a critical point. Justice is not just about solving crimes. It is about keeping the pursuit of truth alive, no matter how long it takes. Bonnie's mother, Karen, faced a system that seemed to be in denial, but she never gave up, and that is something incredibly powerful. Over the next few years, investigators explored various leads. Bonnie had worked at Sam's Club, where two male co-workers were scrutinized as potential suspects. One of the men had reportedly harassed her, and there were claims that he had accessed Bonnie's personnel file to obtain her phone number. Both men submitted DNA samples, but neither was found to be a match to the DNA found on Bonnie's body. Another lead came from a male classmate of Bonnie's, who had written disturbing journal entries about September 28, 1994. His journals contained violent fantasies and expressed a fixation on Bonnie. However, despite the chilling nature of the entries, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the lead eventually fizzled out. As the years went by, the case grew cold. Investigators were still committed to finding Bonnie's killer, but there were no new breakthroughs, that is, until 2006, when the case finally took a dramatic turn. In the early 2000s, DNA technology had been advancing at an unprecedented rate. One of the most powerful tools in the investigative arsenal became the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. This system allowed law enforcement agencies across the United States to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes to those of convicted offenders and arrestees. The system was growing, and new DNA samples were being entered all the time. In Alaska, like many other states, authorities began submitting DNA profiles from unsolved cases to CODIS in the hopes of finding matches. At the same time, Kenneth Dion, a man with a lengthy criminal record, had been arrested and convicted of a series of armed robberies in New Hampshire. As part of his incarceration, his DNA was collected and entered into the national database. However, due to delays and backlogs at the time, Dion's DNA was not uploaded until several years after his conviction. If Alaska or New Hampshire had required DNA collection at the time of arrest rather than post-conviction, the match could have been made much sooner. But fate, it seemed, was on the side of justice. In November 2006, after years of waiting, the breakthrough came. The DNA found on Bonnie's body was finally linked to Kenneth Dion. This part of the story really hit me. It is a testament to the power of technology. We often hear that the criminal justice system is slow or that it is broken, but here we see how innovation and persistence can make a huge difference. What if Bonnie's case had been shelved? What if the technology had not advanced the way it did? This is a turning point that highlights the promise of modern forensic science. DNA testing is an invaluable tool, but what is fascinating here is how the case illustrates the delayed but eventual success of new technology. It was not a perfect system. There were delays, backlogs, and mistakes, but eventually it worked. Sometimes it just takes time for the system to catch up with the truth. Kenneth Dion, the killer unmasked. Kenneth Dion, a former Army paratrooper, had been stationed at Fort Richardson in Anchorage during the early 1990s. After leaving the military, he stayed in the area, accumulating a record of petty theft and assault charges. By the time Bonnie was murdered, Dion had already been in and out of trouble with the law. He was living locally, on probation for robbery, and had been recently released from an Alaskan prison. When investigators looked into Dion's background and movements, they found no known connection to Bonnie. Neither her family nor her friends recognized his name or face. However, when questioned by police, Dion denied knowing Bonnie, and he could not provide a solid alibi for the day of her disappearance. As the investigation deepened, authorities began to link Dion to the crime scene. The medical examiner concluded that Bonnie's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall, as Dion had claimed. Further, a leaf stained with Bonnie's blood was found above the cliff, suggesting she had been injured before being thrown into the creek. The pieces were starting to fit together, but it would take more than just a DNA match to build a solid case against Dion. As the investigation into Bonnie Craig's murder progressed, Kenneth Dion became the central suspect. But it was not enough for investigators to have a DNA match. They needed a solid case, one that could hold up in court. They needed to prove that Dion was not just connected to Bonnie through DNA, but that he was the one who had taken her life. After years of waiting, the case against Kenneth Dion began to take shape. Investigators looked into his movements during the critical period surrounding Bonnie's disappearance. They found that Dion was living in Anchorage at the time of Bonnie's murder. He was known to have kept martial arts weapons in his car, and the severity of Bonnie's injuries, particularly the blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, suggested that a weapon like one of those could have been used. Dion's denial of any connection to Bonnie started to unravel as more evidence came to light. For one, Dion's wife confirmed that he had not been home during the week of Bonnie's disappearance. While Dion insisted he had been out of town, there was no verifiable evidence to support his alibi. The case against him seemed to be building, but the question remained. Could they prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was Bonnie's killer? Kenneth Dion's trial officially began in June 2011, nearly 17 years after Bonnie's death. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Paul Movas, wasted no time in laying out the details of the crime. They began by recounting the events surrounding Bonnie's disappearance on September 28, 1994. Bonnie had left her home early in the morning to catch a bus to her class at the University of Alaska Anchorage, but she never made it. Hours later, Bonnie's body was discovered in McHugh Creek, brutally murdered and discarded like trash. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Kenneth Dion had abducted Bonnie, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her in a violent outburst. He then tried to cover his tracks by dumping her body in a remote creek, hoping the rugged terrain would obscure any evidence. The prosecution was also determined to show that the defense's claim of consensual sex was unfounded. They pointed out that Bonnie was in a long-distance relationship at the time with her boyfriend and had no connection to Dion. The defense's attempt to argue that Bonnie's death was the result of a fall seemed weak in comparison to the evidence of blunt force trauma and the nature of the crime scene. What struck me most about this part of the case was how often the prosecution had to counter the defense's attempts to discredit the facts. This was not just a murder trial. It was a battle over the narrative of what had happened that day. Was Bonnie's death an accident? Was it a consensual encounter that went horribly wrong? Or was it a brutal, premeditated murder? The prosecution worked tirelessly to steer the jury toward the latter explanation. What is always frustrating to me in these cases is how easily a defense attorney can try to muddy the waters. But the fact that the prosecution was able to show the extent of Bonnie's injuries, 11 severe blows to her skull, really pointed to the brutality of the crime. It was clear this was not some tragic accident. Kenneth Dion's defense team argued that Bonnie's death was not a murder, but a tragic accident. They claimed that Bonnie had fallen from the cliff after engaging in a consensual encounter with Dion. They tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and suggested that the evidence could be interpreted in a way that exonerated Dion. They suggested that there was no concrete proof of murder. However, the defense's arguments seemed weak. They had no answer for the severity of Bonnie's injuries, and their suggestion that she had simply fallen did not explain the bloodstains found above the cliff, or the fact that Bonnie had defensive wounds, signs that she had fought her attacker with every ounce of strength. The medical examiner concluded that Bonnie's injuries were consistent with a violent attack, not a fall. The more the defense tried to defend Dion, the clearer it became that they were grasping at straws. The physical evidence, the DNA match, the injuries, the lack of alibi, painted a picture that pointed directly at Dion. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case was handed over to the jury. The jury deliberated for several days, and on June 15, 2011, they returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Kenneth Dion was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault. The relief felt by Bonnie's family was overwhelming. After nearly 17 years, they finally had the closure they had been seeking, but it was a bittersweet moment. No amount of justice could bring Bonnie back. However, the conviction served as a reminder of the importance of perseverance and the role that modern forensic technology played in solving this crime. The conviction of Kenneth Dion was a monumental moment for Bonnie's family, but it was also a triumph for the criminal justice system, which had been repeatedly challenged by this case. The use of DNA evidence was key to bringing a killer to justice after such a long wait. And even though nothing could bring Bonnie back, her family could finally say that they had answers. What struck me about the trial was the emotional weight that came with every decision. For Bonnie's parents, Karen and her father, this was more than just a trial. It was their way of reclaiming their daughter's memory, of making sure that the world knew that Bonnie Craig's life mattered. Kenneth Dion's sentencing followed shortly after the guilty verdict. The judge handed down 2 sentences, 99 years for the murder charge and 25 years for the sexual assault charge, with both sentences to be served consecutively. That meant Dion would spend a total of 124 years in prison. He was 42 years old at the time of his conviction, and he would likely never see the outside world again. At sentencing, Dion continued to deny any involvement in the murder. He interrupted the proceedings to declare that he would never admit guilt, insisting that he was innocent. But the evidence was clear. He had killed Bonnie Craig, and he would pay the price for it. It is always chilling to hear a killer refuse to take responsibility for their actions, even after being convicted. But that is part of the process. No matter how much they deny it, the truth is undeniable. For Bonnie's family, the conviction and sentencing were the culmination of years of pain and frustration. They had fought for justice, and in the end, they got it. It was not perfect, it could never bring Bonnie back, but it was a reminder of the importance of never giving up. The lesson here is simple. Even when it feels like justice is out of reach, even when it seems like the system is failing, perseverance and modern forensic tools can bring the truth to light. Bonnie's family never gave up, and in the end, they were rewarded with the justice they deserved. The murders of Eric and Pam Ellander, Sulphur, Louisiana, 1991. As we transition from the haunting case of Bonnie Craig to the tragic story of Eric and Pam Ellander, we see a different kind of mystery unfold. The Ellanders were a young, married couple living a quiet life in a rural community in Sulphur, Louisiana. Their story is one of brutality, betrayal, and confusion, a case where justice was not as clear-cut as it initially seemed. On the night of February 10, 1991, Eric and Pam Ellander followed their typical routine. Eric, 21, worked at a local chemical plant, while Pam, 19, stayed at home to care for their 18-month-old daughter, Ashley. The couple had been married for just 2 years and were described by family and friends as a loving, responsible couple. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when family members last spoke to them on the phone around 9:00 p.m. that night. But in the early hours of February 11th, tragedy struck. Between 1:00 and 3:00 a.m., an intruder entered the Ellanders' home. There were no signs of forced entry, which immediately suggested that the killer either knew the couple or had easy access to the home. By the time Pam's grandmother, Betty Littleton, arrived at the house the next morning, she found the front door unlocked and the home eerily quiet. As she walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, she discovered the bodies of Eric and Pam lying side by side in their bed, partially covered by blankets. The scene was gruesome. Blood spattered across the walls and ceiling, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. The moment I read about this case, I was struck by the horror of it all. Eric and Pam were young, just starting their lives together, when they were ruthlessly taken from the world. The brutality of their murders, the shotgun blasts to their heads, speaks to a level of violence that is hard to comprehend. What kind of person could carry out such a calculated and brutal act? And why? What struck me as well was how the investigators initially grappled with the lack of clear evidence. The absence of forced entry and the fact that the couple had not shown signs of struggle suggested an intimate familiarity with their killer. This clue would become critical in the investigation. When investigators arrived at the scene, the first thing they noticed was the lack of forced entry. All the doors and windows were intact, which led them to believe that the killer had either entered through an unlocked door or was familiar with the house and its residents. It did not take long to realize that this was a targeted attack. The crime scene itself offered several key observations. Eric and Pam were found lying side by side, with Eric's left arm draped across Pam's torso. This indicated that they were likely asleep when the attack occurred. Autopsies revealed that Eric had been shot first, with a single blast to the left temple. Pam, who was shot moments later, took a direct blast to her right cheek, so powerful that it nearly decapitated her. Despite the brutality of the murders, there was no sign of a struggle. Investigators initially thought the couple had been attacked while sleeping, as neither victim showed signs of defensive wounds. However, bruising on Eric's knuckles, initially thought to indicate a fight, was later attributed to his manual labor job, ruling out any physical altercation before the shooting. Something eerily personal about a crime like this, when a couple is murdered in their own home, a place where they should have felt the safest. The brutality of the shotgun blasts left no room for doubt. This was not just a random act. It was an attack on a family. And the fact that there was no forced entry, that was one of the most disturbing elements of the case. To me, it felt like the killer knew the Eulanders. This was not a robbery gone wrong, it was an execution. That feeling would only grow stronger as the investigation unfolded. One of the key pieces of evidence that emerged was the missing vehicle. Eric and Pam's green 1989 Toyota 4Runner had disappeared from the driveway, along with Eric's wallet and Pam's purse. Although there was a jewelry box in the bedroom that appeared to have been rummaged through, investigators were unsure if anything of value had actually been taken. Forensic investigators found no usable fingerprints or DNA at the scene, leaving the investigators with few leads. But then, 4 days later, the Toyota 4Runner was found parked outside a motel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, about 135 miles away from Sulphur. Inside the vehicle were 4 local teenagers, Chris Prudhomme, Robert Atkins, Philip Leo, and Kurt Reed. The teens were arrested during a routine traffic stop, and their involvement in the case seemed to be the break investigators had been waiting for. This part of the story really highlights how crucial seemingly small details can be in an investigation. The fact that the vehicle was found so far from the crime scene was an unusual and significant clue. It is always fascinating to me how investigators piece together these puzzles, sometimes by following what seem like trivial leads. But in this case, the discovery of the car in Baton Rouge was one of the key moments that pushed the investigation forward. Chris Prudhomme, the eldest of the four suspects, quickly became the focus of the investigation. Within hours of his arrest, Chris confessed to the murders in a videotaped statement. He described how he had entered the Ellanders' home, shot Eric and Pam, and then stolen their vehicle. However, there were serious inconsistencies in Chris's confession. For one, he had not been able to provide specific details about the layout of the house, details that only someone familiar with the interior of the home would know. He could not describe the location of the nursery where the couple's infant daughter, Ashley, was found. Additionally, forensic evidence from the crime scene and the car, such as fingerprints and soil samples, had not been analyzed thoroughly, leaving important gaps in the investigation. Despite Chris's confession, his story did not add up. The police began to question whether he had acted alone or if he was covering for someone else. This is the point where things started to get really murky. At first, Chris's confession seemed like the resolution the investigators were hoping for, but as more details were uncovered, doubts started to creep in. The fact that Chris could not even describe the house he was supposedly familiar with was a huge red flag. It made me wonder whether he was trying to protect someone else, someone he was loyal to. It was a case of conflicting narratives, one that needed more investigation. 17 days after his arrest, Chris Prudhomme was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself, and though he was rushed to the hospital, he never regained consciousness. His death was ruled a suicide, but it left behind a series of unanswered questions. A handwritten note was found in his cell, in which he took sole responsibility for the murders and absolved his friends of any involvement. The note was chilling, defiant, and disturbing. Chris wrote, "I enjoyed very much in the taking of those two individuals' lives. I do not need society." The letter seemed to confirm that Chris was, in some twisted way, proud of what he had done. But it also raised more questions about his motives and whether he was truly acting alone. Chris's death and the note he left behind really added to the complexity of this case. The chilling confession in his letter was unsettling, but it also raised more doubts. Was Chris truly the sole killer, or was he protecting someone else? Was there more to this story that we were not hearing? I can't help but think about how the pressure of being arrested, combined with the guilt of his actions, might have driven Chris to take his own life. But the real tragedy here is that the Ellander family did not get the full story, and that truth remains elusive. As Chris's death closed the case for the sheriff's department, the Ellander family remained unconvinced that they had the full story. Pam's father, Huey Littleton, a private investigator, began his own investigation into the murders, speaking with over 100 people and uncovering rumors about the involvement of others. Through his efforts, Huey began to unravel a web of secrets that pointed to a much darker truth. After the sheriff's department declared the case closed, citing Chris Prudhomme's confession and subsequent suicide as the resolution, one person refused to let the story end there: Huey Littleton. Pam's father, a private investigator, was convinced that the truth about his daughter's death had not been fully uncovered. Huey's determination to uncover the full story would lead him down a path filled with shocking revelations, rumors, and allegations. His quest for justice not only opened new doors in the investigation, but also pointed to a series of troubling connections, ones that suggested the sheriff's department might not have been as diligent in their investigation as they had claimed. Huey Littleton's search for answers led him to a group called SCATER, an acronym that stood for Satan's Kids Against the Establishment. This group, made up of local teenagers, had a reputation for being involved in occult activities and criminal behavior. Through interviews with acquaintances, Huey discovered disturbing rumors about the group's involvement in the Ellander murders. Several witnesses, including former girlfriends of group members, claimed that Chris Prudhomme was not alone the night of the murders. They suggested that at least one other member of the SCATER group had been involved in the break-in and the subsequent killings. According to these witnesses, the group's original intent was not murder but burglary. The situation escalated, they said, after the group members became high on LSD, leading to violent behavior that resulted in Eric and Pam's deaths. Perhaps most chilling of all were allegations that a party had taken place at the Ellanders' home shortly after the murders. Witnesses claimed to have seen a large group of teenagers at the house, drinking and using drugs, unaware that Eric and Pam's bodies were still in the bedroom. According to some, videos existed that depicted not only the murders but also the sexual abuse of victims' bodies. However, these claims were never substantiated, and the existence of such tapes remains unverified. This part of the story made my blood run cold. The idea of a group of teenagers, drugged, perhaps high on LSD, breaking into a home and murdering an innocent couple is deeply disturbing. The rumors of a party and videos of the crime were chilling, but it also raised so many questions about what kind of people were involved in this and what they were capable of. The fact that Huey found such a tangled web of secrets, rumors, and unverified claims really spoke to the complexity of the case. It made me realize how difficult it can be to sift through the noise and find the truth, especially when so many layers of deception and fear are at play. As Huey delved deeper into his investigation, he uncovered even more disturbing allegations. There were whispers that the sheriff's department had mishandled the case, possibly even covering up certain details to protect individuals who may have been connected to local law enforcement or influential families. One particularly troubling rumor involved the sheriff's own son, Richard, who was allegedly seen at the Ellanders' house after the murders. Some witnesses claimed that he had attended the party held by the skater group, though these allegations were never proven and were denied by the sheriff. These suspicions of a cover-up added another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. Huey began to question whether the sheriff's department had deliberately closed the case too quickly to avoid further scrutiny or to protect certain people. The idea of a cover-up in a small town is a chilling thought, and the fact that Huey's investigation pointed to possible corruption within law enforcement made me think about how deep the layers of deceit can go when powerful people are involved. It also made me wonder if the sheriff's department rushed to close the case for reasons other than justice. When law enforcement itself may be compromised, it becomes even more difficult for families to find closure. In this case, Huey was not just fighting to bring his daughter's killers to justice. He was fighting against a system that seemed unwilling to pursue the full truth. Huey's relentless investigation eventually led to a significant legal development. After presenting his findings to a grand jury, Huey was able to reopen the case and bring fresh charges against several individuals who had previously escaped serious scrutiny. This was a monumental moment, a rare instance where a private citizen's efforts led to the reopening of a murder investigation. One of the most significant developments came when Kim Manuel, a member of the skater group, was indicted. Kim had been implicated in the murders, and during a secretly recorded conversation with her cousin, she described details of the killings. Although she stopped short of admitting to being present during the murders, the grand jury felt that the evidence was strong enough to charge her with 2 counts of second-degree murder. However, the case against Kim Manuel would not be as straightforward as it seemed. Her defense team argued that the tape had been rehearsed, and they cast doubt on the credibility of her cousin, Pearl Fruge, who had secretly recorded the conversation. The grand jury eventually dropped the charges against Kim, citing insufficient evidence. The fact that Huey was able to convince the legal system to reopen the case was an incredible victory. But the legal challenges that came with it showed just how difficult it is to hold people accountable, especially when the evidence is shaky or circumstantial. Kim Manuel's case was a prime example of how the legal system can be both a weapon and a shield. Even when there is evidence suggesting involvement, it is not always enough to win a conviction. Huey's determination to bring the truth to light, despite the legal obstacles, is something I deeply admire. It is a testament to the lengths that some families will go to for justice, even when the system seems to be working against them. In February 1995, nearly 4 years after the murders, more legal actions were taken against the remaining suspects. Robert Atkins, who had been arrested along with Chris Prudhomme and the others, was indicted for his role in the killings. Atkins was 18 at the time of the murders and had a significant role in the events leading up to the deaths of Eric and Pam. Atkins ultimately pled guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent 21-year prison terms for the manslaughter charges and an additional 5 years for auto theft. However, because he had already served time for the auto theft charge, his manslaughter sentence was reduced to just over 5 years. Philip Leo and Kurt Ree, who had also been involved in the murder, were charged as accessories after the fact. Leo was sentenced to 4 years in prison, while Ree received a 2-year sentence. These sentences reflected their roles in assisting the murderers after the fact, rather than in the killings themselves. The convictions and sentences were a bittersweet outcome for the Ellander family. While it was comforting to see that some of the people responsible for their loved ones' deaths were held accountable, it was not enough to erase the trauma of the murders. These sentences, especially the lighter ones for those involved after the murders, felt incomplete. The lingering question of who was truly behind the killings and whether all of the responsible parties were brought to justice remained unresolved. Despite the legal proceedings and the efforts of Huey Littleton, the full truth of what happened the night Eric and Pam were murdered remains elusive. Was Chris Prudhomme truly the sole perpetrator? Or was he protecting others in the skater group? What role did drugs and occult activities play in the crime? Did local law enforcement mishandle the investigation, or even cover up key details? These questions continue to haunt the Ellander family and the community of Sulphur, Louisiana. While some justice was served, there is a sense that the full story may never be known. As I reflect on this case, I can't help but think about how often we encounter unfinished stories in the pursuit of justice. Not all cases can be neatly wrapped up with a conviction and closure. The Ellander murders are a powerful reminder that the pursuit of truth is often messy, and sometimes we may never get all the answers we are looking for. But that does not mean we stop searching. And for the Ellander family, they fought for their loved ones, even when the truth seemed elusive. The murder of Brooke Baker, Vincennes, Indiana, 1997. Brooke Baker was born on April 24, 1978, in Vincennes, Indiana. By the time she entered college at Vincennes University, she had already demonstrated a natural aptitude for writing and storytelling. Brooke's passion for journalism quickly became apparent, and she threw herself into her studies with intensity and dedication. She even became the editor of the university's student newspaper, The Trailblazer, and was known for her ambitious, fearless approach to investigative reporting. Her brother, Braun Baker, described her as headstrong and independent qualities that made her a standout in her field. Brooke was confident, engaging, and made a significant impact on her peers and professors alike. She had a future ahead of her, one that seemed bright and full of promise. Her work as an investigative reporter was just beginning to gain traction when tragedy struck. In 1997, Brooke took on a sensitive and potentially dangerous story. She began investigating an alleged sexual assault involving a member of a campus fraternity. The alleged victim, a former student, had claimed she was raped by a fraternity member but was pressured to leave the university due to insufficient institutional support. Brooke's investigation into this story would not only challenge the university, but also put her own life at risk in ways no one could have predicted. Brooke's story really stood out to me because of her fierce dedication to uncovering the truth. Here was a young woman with a promising career ahead of her, someone who could have easily taken a safer route. But instead, she chose to pursue a story that could change lives. She was not just reporting, she was standing up for someone who had been wronged, and in doing so, she put herself in harm's way. The bravery it takes to go after a story like this, knowing that you could be targeted, is something I deeply respect. But it also makes me wonder how often stories like these go untold, because the people involved are afraid of the consequences. As Brooke dug deeper into the case, things began to escalate. She received multiple threats from fraternity members who wanted her to drop the story. One particular threat stood out. A fraternity member allegedly told Brooke, "I would be dead if I mentioned a fraternity in any story I was writing." Despite these threats, Brooke remained undeterred. She believed that the truth needed to be told, and she was determined to expose the systemic failures that allowed sexual assault to be swept under the rug. In addition to the threats from the fraternity, Brooke also began experiencing harassment from another unexpected source. Her landlord, Mike Nardine, who was a part-time officer on campus security. Brooke had confided in her friends and professors about how Nardine had been entering her apartment unannounced, sometimes using his key to let himself in. She felt as though she was being watched, and the feeling of being stalked by Nardine grew stronger as time went on. Eventually, she filed complaints with campus police about his intrusive behavior, but little was done to address her concerns. Her friends, professors, and family began to notice that Brooke was becoming more and more concerned about her safety. She shared emails and notes with her father, Tom Baker, detailing the threats and intrusions she had been experiencing. Tom, understandably alarmed, stored the notes in a tin box, keeping them as potential evidence. though he hoped he would never have to use them. Brooke's determination to expose the truth about the fraternity and the assault was unwavering. She continued to gather information and conduct interviews, fully aware of the dangers that surrounded her. The pressures from the fraternity and her landlord were beginning to take a toll on her, but she refused to back down. As I read more about Brooke's investigation, I found myself feeling both admiration and sadness. Brooke was clearly someone who lived for the truth, someone who believed that standing up for what is right was more important than her own safety. But the reality is that sometimes, when you are up against powerful people or institutions, you are not always protected. Brooke's persistence in the face of danger is something to be praised, but it also raises a difficult question. What does it take to keep people safe when they are pursuing the truth, and how much are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of justice? On the evening of September 6, 1997, Brooke attended 2 off-campus parties with friends. Those who saw her last described her as being in good spirits, with no indication that anything was amiss. She was last seen alive at approximately 1:30 a.m. on September 7th, when a friend walked her back to her apartment on Harrison Street, just a short distance from the university campus. The next day, on September 7th, Brooke's younger brother, Bron, became concerned when he could not reach her by phone. After repeated attempts to contact her, he decided to go to her apartment, use his own key to enter. What he found inside would forever change his life. Brooke was found in her bed, her body nude and covered in blood. The crime scene was horrific, and the violence was unimaginable. An autopsy revealed that Brooke had suffered 11 deep stab wounds to her back and 1 to her left breast, which severed her pulmonary artery and caused fatal blood loss. Ligature marks around her neck indicated that she had been strangled, likely in an attempt to subdue her, before the stabbing began. Bruises on her wrists, inner thighs, and elbows indicated a desperate struggle, suggesting that Brooke had fought fiercely for her life. The presence of a kitchen knife, found bent and soaked in soapy water in the sink, suggested that the killer had attempted to clean up the crime scene. The bathroom was a mess, with wet towels strewn around an overflowing bathtub, showing further signs of an attempt to destroy evidence. There was no sign of forced entry, and all the doors and windows were locked. This led detectives to believe that Brooke knew her killer or had let them in willingly. The brutality of Brooke's murder was shocking. To think that someone with so much potential, someone who had dedicated herself to uncovering the truth, was taken in such a violent and senseless way is heartbreaking. The signs of a struggle of her fighting for her life made the crime even more horrific. It is hard to wrap your mind around the fact that Brooke had no chance to defend herself against such a violent attack. And the fact that there were no signs of forced entry only deepened the mystery. Who could have done this to her, and why? The investigation into Brooke's murder was extensive, but it quickly became apparent that there were no easy answers. Forensic investigators found DNA at the scene, including under Brooke's fingernails, and on the bed sheets, but at the time, the DNA did not match anyone in the law enforcement databases. This left detectives with little to go on. At first, suspicion fell on Brooke's landlord, Mike Nardine. His access to her apartment, combined with the harassment that Brooke had experienced, made him a prime suspect. However, when Nardine was questioned by police and agreed to submit a DNA sample, the results came back inconclusive. The DNA found at the crime scene did not match his. Investigators also looked at Brooke's personal life. She had been dating 2 men at the time, Steve and Tommy, and both provided alibis for the night of her murder. However, there were gaps in their timelines, which made their alibis questionable. Both men voluntarily gave DNA samples, but neither match was found. As the investigation progressed, police considered other theories. One of these was that Brooke's killer may have been a stranger, someone who had responded to a roommate ad that Brooke had placed in the university's student newspaper. However, only one person had responded to the ad, and police were unable to identify or locate this individual. The theory remained speculative and led nowhere. This part of the investigation was particularly frustrating for me. There was so much uncertainty, so many leads that just did not seem to go anywhere. The fact that there were gaps in the alibis of the men in her life, combined with the DNA evidence that did not match anyone, made it seem like the case was stuck in a dead end. The idea that Brooke's killer might have been a stranger who posed as a potential roommate only added another layer of complexity. How could they track down someone who had not even left a trace? As time passed, Brooks' murder seemed to sink further into the cold cases pile. The investigation stalled, with no new leads. But then, in 1999, another case emerged that would inadvertently breathe new life into the search for Brooks' killer. This case would become the key to unlocking a mystery that had eluded justice for more than 2 years. On July 5, 1999, Erica Norman, a Vincennes University student, was reported missing. She had failed to attend her classes and had not contacted her family or friends. Witnesses reported last seeing Erica at the Green Parrot, a local bar, where she had been drinking and dancing with Brian Jones, a 22-year-old Vincennes resident and VU alumnus. Jones had offered to drive Erica home, and surveillance footage confirmed that the two left together around midnight. Days later, on July 20, 1999, Erica's decomposing body was discovered in a plastic storage tub in a cornfield in Lawrence County, Illinois, about 30 miles away from Vincennes. An autopsy revealed that Erica had been assaulted, strangled, and stabbed multiple times in the back. The crime scene showed disturbing similarities to the one in Brooke Baker's case: towels soaked in an overflowing bathtub, a kitchen sink filled with soapy water, and the meticulous cleaning efforts to destroy evidence. The similarities between the two murders were immediately apparent to the investigators, and they quickly linked the cases together. The most significant piece of evidence came when DNA recovered from Erica's body was matched to the DNA collected from Brooks' crime scene. This DNA connection was the breakthrough that detectives had been desperately waiting for. When I first came across this part of the story, I could not help but marvel at the way cases can sometimes intersect in the most unexpected ways. Here we had two seemingly unrelated murders, Brooks and Erica's, that, over 2 years later, were suddenly linked through DNA evidence. It is a reminder of how interconnected things can be, and how one breakthrough in a new case can illuminate long, unsolved mysteries from the past. It is amazing that after so much time, the connection between the two cases was made. The similarity in the way both women were murdered was chilling, and it made me realize how much we rely on these forensic breakthroughs to uncover the truth. Without that DNA match, Brooks' case could have stayed cold for even longer. After the DNA match was confirmed, investigators turned their attention to Brian Jones, who had been with Erica Norman the night she disappeared. When questioned, Jones claimed that he had accompanied Erica to her apartment to watch a movie, but he left after she fell asleep on the couch. He also volunteered to provide a DNA sample and allowed police to search his car and home. However, forensic analysis quickly turned up evidence that linked Jones to both Erica Norman's and Brooke Baker's murders. Erica's blood was found on the floor mats of Jones's car, as well as on a pair of shoes he owned. Additionally, DNA recovered from both crime scenes was a match to Jones. Jones had also attended a fraternity party near Brooks' apartment on the night of her murder, and witnesses confirmed that he had been at the party and had left around 2:00 a.m., which was within the critical time frame of Brooks' murder. The investigation revealed more chilling details. Jones had rented the 1996 film Curdled, a crime thriller that depicted a murder almost identical to Brooks'. In the film, a killer stabs a victim multiple times in the back, cleans the knife in a sink, and disposes of bloody towels in a bathtub, exactly the same method used in Brooks' murder. This eerie parallel would become one of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Jones. This part of the investigation blew my mind. Not only was there DNA evidence linking Jones to both murders, but the fact that he had rented Curdled, a film that depicted a murder strikingly similar to Brooks', was incredibly unsettling. The idea that a crime might have been influenced by a movie is a chilling thought, but in this case, it seems almost impossible to ignore. For me, it is a reminder of how sometimes the smallest details, like a rented film, can tie everything together. It is a sickening thought that Jones might have been inspired by what he saw on screen, but it also shows how methodical and calculated his actions were. He was not just a random stranger. He was someone who was familiar with the process of violence. With the overwhelming evidence against him, Jones was charged with the murder of Erica Norman. During his trial, Jones denied any involvement in Brooke Baker's murder, though the DNA evidence and the chilling parallels to the Curdled movie were impossible to overlook. The prosecution argued that the evidence against Jones was clear. He was seen leaving the party near Brooks' apartment. At the critical time, his DNA matched both crime scenes, and his actions mirrored those of the killer in Curdled. It was a disturbing combination of circumstances that painted a clear picture of his guilt. In August 2000, Jones pleaded guilty to the murder of Erica Norman as part of a plea agreement that spared him the death penalty. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for her murder. However, Jones continued to maintain his innocence in Brooks' case, despite the evidence linking him to both crimes. Though Jones was convicted for Erica Norman's murder, the prosecution still sought justice for Brooke Baker. The DNA evidence and the timeline of events left little room for doubt in the minds of those investigating her murder. Jones's plea deal in the Erica Norman case was a small victory for justice, but it did not provide the closure that Brooks' family needed. He was sentenced to a long prison term, but his refusal to take responsibility for Brooks' murder added a layer of frustration to an already painful situation. For Brooks' family, this was the final piece of the puzzle, a confirmation that the man who took their daughter's life was now behind bars. But the fact that Jones never confessed to Brooks' murder, despite all the evidence, left me with a sense of unfinished business. Sometimes, the most important part of justice is hearing the truth, even if it comes too late. The case against Brian Jones for Brooks' murder went to trial, and in the face of overwhelming DNA evidence, he was convicted of her murder. Despite his attempts to deny involvement, the facts were undeniable. Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Brooks' family, this was the moment they had been waiting for. After years of searching for answers, they finally had the justice they deserved. But the pain of losing Brooke, of knowing that her life was cut short by a senseless act of violence, remained. Brooks' case is a painful reminder of the price of justice. Even though her family finally got the answers they had been seeking, it came after years of uncertainty, heartache, and frustration. The idea of waiting so long for justice must have been unbearable, and I can't help but feel for them. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to keep fighting for what is right, even when it feels like the world is against you. In the end, Brooks' story became more than just a tragic murder. It became a fight for justice that helped to uncover deeper truths about the systems we trust to protect us. As we reflect on the tragic stories of Bonnie Craig, Eric and Pam Ellander, and Brooke Baker, there are powerful lessons that stand out from each case. These are not just stories of victims and perpetrators. They are stories of families who refused to give up, of investigators who followed through despite roadblocks, and of technology that changed the course of justice. One of the most significant themes that emerge from these cases is the power of modern forensic technology. In Bonnie Craig's case, it was the advancement of DNA technology and the expansion of national databases like CODIS that allowed investigators to finally make a connection between the crime scene and the criminal. The DNA match in Bonnie's case was a crucial turning point, allowing authorities to catch a killer who had escaped justice for over a decade. Similarly, in the cases of Eric and Pam Ellander and Brooke Baker, DNA played a pivotal role in linking the perpetrators to the crimes, even when they initially denied involvement. The ability to track and match DNA evidence, even years after the crime, has revolutionized criminal investigations, providing hope to families who might otherwise never find answers. But technology is not the only force at play in these cases. It is often the relentless perseverance of family members, like Bonnie's mother, Karen, and Brooke's father, Tom, who refuse to let the memory of their loved ones fade into obscurity. It is their fight for justice that keeps the fire of inquiry burning when all seems lost. For me, one of the most striking parts of these stories is how technology played such an essential role in these cases. Without DNA evidence and the advances in forensic technology, Bonnie's case might have remained a cold case forever. Eric and Pam's murders, too, would likely never have been fully resolved without the DNA match. And in Brooks' case, the DNA evidence linking Brian Jones to the crime scene helped secure his conviction and bring closure to her family. However, technology is not infallible. It is the relentless human pursuit of truth and justice that propels these investigations forward. What struck me the most is how the search for justice never stops. Even when the evidence is not clear, when the leads dry up, when the system does not seem to be working in your favor, the human spirit can find a way to push through. Another lesson we learn from these stories is the power of persistence and the critical role that families and loved ones play in seeking justice. In each of these cases, the victims' families were not content to let their loved ones' deaths be forgotten. They pushed authorities to keep looking for answers, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. Bonnie's mother, Karen, played an instrumental role in keeping her daughter's case alive. When the police investigation seemed to stall, she was vocal about her dissatisfaction and pushed for more attention to be given to the case. Her tireless advocacy ultimately led to the breakthrough that brought Bonnie's killer to justice. Similarly, Pam's father, Huey, took matters into his own hands by conducting his own investigation into the Ellander murders, uncovering vital information that led to the reopening of the case and the indictment of several individuals. In Brooke Baker's case, her parents Tom and Janet never gave up on finding out what happened to their daughter. They worked tirelessly with law enforcement, following every lead, and even kept records of Brooke's threats and suspicions, which ultimately helped the police to make crucial connections. I am always struck by how the families in these cases never gave up, even when the system seemed to fail them. I can't imagine the pain of losing a loved one under such tragic circumstances, but the strength they showed is something that truly inspires me. It is easy to give up when it feels like the world has moved on, but these families did not allow their loved ones to be forgotten. They fought for justice, and in many ways, they became the catalyst for change. We often hear about the importance of law enforcement in solving crimes, but the truth is that sometimes it is the loved ones of the victims who push the system to do the right thing. It is a powerful reminder of the importance of family and community in the pursuit of justice. While these stories have endings that bring a sense of justice and closure, they also reveal the failures within the system. Failures that allowed victims to be forgotten, cases to go unsolved, and perpetrators to walk free for too long. These cases remind us that the pursuit of justice is not always straightforward. Bonnie Craig's case shows us how forensic science, while a powerful tool, can be delayed by bureaucratic hurdles. It was not until DNA profiles were added to national databases and cross-referenced across state lines that investigators could finally make a match and bring her killer to justice. It took more than a decade for the truth to come out, and during that time, Bonnie's family was forced to live with unanswered questions and pain. Eric and Pam Ellander's case points to the flaws in investigative procedures and the dangers of rushing to judgment. Chris Prudhomme's initial confession seemed like the resolution to the case, but it was later revealed to be full of inconsistencies. In cases like this, it is essential for investigators to remain vigilant, to question every lead, and to ensure that justice is not prematurely declared when there are still pieces left to uncover. Brooke Baker's murder case, too, serves as a sobering reminder of how the system can fail victims. The lack of immediate action by law enforcement, despite her clear signs of harassment, left Brooke vulnerable. Even after her murder, the investigation was slow and fraught with doubts. But once again, persistence and modern forensic tools ultimately solved the case. These cases show us that while the criminal justice system has come a long way, it is still imperfect. There are flaws, there are delays, and there are failures that often go unnoticed. Forensic technology, while revolutionary, does not solve everything. It is up to the people investigating the case and the families pushing for answers to make sure that justice is served. We can't ignore the human element in this process, and we should not. It is the commitment to truth, the refusal to give up, that ultimately brings about justice. In the end, while justice was served in these cases, it did not bring back the victims or erase the pain of their families. Bonnie Craig's family, Eric and Pam Ellander's family, and Brooke Baker's family will carry the scars of their losses for the rest of their lives. The closure they received was hard-earned, and it came after years of pain, uncertainty, and fear. But it is important to remember that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, the pursuit of justice remains vital. These families fought to ensure that their loved ones' deaths were not in vain. They made sure the world knew their names, and they kept fighting until the truth was revealed. In the end, their perseverance reminds us all of the importance of never giving up in the search for justice, no matter how long it takes. The stories of these families, their pain, their resilience, and their unwavering pursuit of justice are a reminder of the strength of the human spirit. As I think about these cases, I can't help but feel that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what is right, even when the path forward is uncertain. These families did not let the world forget their loved ones, and their stories remind us that no one is truly gone until their memory fades. Justice is a powerful force, and it is one that can change the course of history, even if it takes years to arrive. These three cases, Bonnie Craig, Eric and Pam Ellander, and Brooke Baker, highlight the complexities of the justice system, the power of technology, and the relentless determination of families who refuse to give up. While justice may not always be swift, the pursuit of truth is never in vain. The lessons we learn from these stories remind us that even in the face of tragedy, there is always hope for justice. As we bring these stories to a close, it is impossible not to reflect on the broader themes that tie them together. Each of these cases, whether it is the tragic loss of Bonnie Craig, the brutal murders of Eric and Pam Ellander, or the heartbreaking death of Brooke Baker, speaks to the fundamental need for justice in society, but it also underscores something far deeper: the human cost of unresolved violence, and the tireless quest for truth no matter the personal cost. These stories have a way of sticking with you long after the final verdict is read, and the questions they raise are just as relevant today as they were when the crimes occurred. What happens when the system fails? How does justice survive when time erodes the evidence? And how can we ensure that victims are remembered even when the world seems to forget them? Justice, as we have seen, is not always about the verdict. It is not just about the final decision handed down in a courtroom. It is about the journey. The years of searching for answers, the frustrations of dead ends, the emotional toll it takes on families and communities. The finality of a sentence does not always equate to closure. The psychological scars of the victims' families remain long after the case is solved. For Bonnie Craig's family, the victory of seeing Kenneth Dion convicted did not bring their daughter back. For Eric and Pam Ellander's family, even though many of the responsible individuals were convicted, there remained a sense of ambiguity surrounding the full truth. Brooke Baker's family, despite the justice secured by DNA evidence, continues to mourn the loss of a young life cut short by someone who was never truly held accountable for his full role in her death. The most profound part of these cases is that justice, no matter how well served, never truly heals the wound left by the loss. The pain of losing a loved one to violence cannot be undone, no matter how long the criminal investigation lasts or how thorough the trial may be. Even when a conviction brings justice, it does not replace what is lost. The families of these victims continue to live with the shadow of their loss every day. However, their fight for justice is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It shows that even when the world seems to forget, when the case goes cold, there are still people who will keep pushing for the truth, no matter the cost. One of the most significant takeaways from these cases is the importance of remembering the victims and telling their stories. These are not just cases to be solved. They are stories of individuals, real people, with futures, families, and dreams. They were more than just victims. They were loved ones, friends, and community members whose lives were violently interrupted. In many ways, their stories serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring importance of justice. The work that the families did in keeping the cases alive, in pushing for new leads and new investigations, is vital. It ensures that their loved ones' deaths are not in vain, and that their memories live on, not as just a case number or a footnote in a report, but as an ongoing testament to their humanity. It is so easy to forget or to reduce cases like these to headlines or statistics. But each victim was a person, a son, a daughter, a sister, a brother. As we tell these stories, I think it is essential to emphasize the humanity behind them. Justice is not just about the law. It is about remembering the people whose lives were lost and ensuring that their stories are heard. The families who advocate for justice for their loved ones remind us that everyone deserves to have their story told and their memory honored. While these cases were ultimately solved, they also exposed the flaws and gaps within the justice system. Whether it was the delay in DNA testing, missteps in the initial investigations, or the difficulty in connecting seemingly unrelated cases, the justice system is far from perfect. But it is through these imperfections that we see resilience of the families who demand more, who demand better. They push for the changes needed to ensure that the same mistakes are not made again. For instance, Bonnie's case showed the limitations of the justice system in the pre-DNA era, but it also highlighted the powerful role that advances in technology can play in solving cold cases. In the case of Eric and Pam Ellander, the flawed early investigation was corrected by the tireless efforts of Pam's father, Huey. And for Brooke, her case revealed just how slow the system can be to react to signs of harassment and threats until it is too late. But these shortcomings are not necessarily failures. They are opportunities for improvement. We can learn from these cases. We can push for better training, more efficient systems, and a quicker response to justice. And most importantly, we can continue to push for a system that works harder to protect victims before it is too late. I have always believed that justice is not a static concept. It evolves, it grows, and it changes. These cases are proof that, while the system is not perfect, it can learn from its failures. It is important to acknowledge the flaws, but we must also celebrate the progress we have made. DNA technology, forensic science, and advocacy from families and communities have all played a role in making sure that these cases were solved. We have come a long way, but there is still more to be done. As we conclude these stories, the most important lesson is clear: never stop fighting for justice. Even when it feels like the system is working against you, even when the answers seem impossible to find, persistence and dedication can make a difference. The families we have explored in this video showed us what it means to truly fight for justice, not just for the victims, but for future generations who rely on the legal system to ensure safety and accountability. Justice is not always quick, and it is not always easy, but it is worth fighting for. And in these three cases, we saw how perseverance, courage, and the advancement of technology can ultimately bring justice to those who need it most. These are not just tragic stories. They are stories of resilience, and they remind us all that the pursuit of justice is a never-ending battle worth fighting for. In closing, I want to say that these cases have made me think deeply about the importance of justice, the perseverance of the human spirit, and the need for constant vigilance in the pursuit of truth. It is easy to lose hope when things seem impossible, but these families remind us that even in the darkest moments, we must continue to fight for what is right. Justice is not just a goal, it is a journey. And as long as we continue to fight for it, we honor the memory of those who have been lost and the families who love them. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories as impactful as I did, I encourage you to share them and continue the conversation about justice and the importance of fighting for what is right. We owe it to the victims to never forget their stories and to ensure that justice continues to evolve.